I want to officially welcome everyone, all of our bookseller attendees and some other attendees and our panelists and our host Valerie to our very first bookseller summer camp 2020 official event. We did have a couple of field trips for the last few days and last week, which were really fun to go to. So we appreciate everyone being here, and I will just a couple of housekeeping things. The Q&As, if you have any questions while we're going through the presentation, please just put something in the Q&A. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to a few questions at the end. If you'll feel free to chat to everyone, tell us what you're thinking, who you are, where you're from. We'd love to hear from you. I want to thank HarperCollins so much for sending Christina here today with us, and Algonquin Books for supporting Larry to be here with us. And I think that's the housekeeping. We'll talk a little bit about some upcoming events at the end of the session. So I want to start by welcoming Valerie Koehler from Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston, Texas, who is going to be our host and moderator today. So Valerie, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Heather. I'm so excited to be here and thrilled to be here with these two wonderful authors and two wonderful books. Let's get started. I think we talked a little bit beforehand, but Larry, since your book comes out first, you want to get started here and tell us a little bit about your book and give us a little background on your characters and just that little sales pitch that we all need to hand sell your book.
It took me years to write this book, but that was easier than trying to do this. And I think about this book as the story of an extraordinary, ordinary woman. It's the story of Edie Pritchard. In the first section, she is Edie Linderman. She's married to one of the visual aid. She's married to one of the Linderman twins. The way I originally conceived this book was that it was going to be a book about the Linderman brothers, the twins, in love with the same woman. And it's not as though that isn't true of the book, but as I was writing, it became more and more Edie's story. And as I said, I think of her as an extraordinary, ordinary woman in her small town of Gladstone, Montana, where she grew up and went to school and met her husband to be. People just sort of knew her as a pretty girl, a pretty and popular girl. And it's not as though that doesn't apply, but I think her good looks, her beauty, blind people to a lot of other important qualities that she has. She's intelligent, she's strong, she's loyal, and she has been underestimated for much of her life. And I tried to show through 3 or 4 important road trips at crisis points in her life. I tried to find some means to show what an extraordinary person that she was. The novel covers 40 years in her life, and so it takes her from the age of 24 to 64. And through relationships, she's a mother, she's a grandmother, and there are times when she has to come to the rescue of other people, even though it means putting herself in jeopardy. And there are guns.
That's great. Well, if I had done this correctly, I would have introduced our panelists. Why don't we go back a few minutes? Larry Watson lives in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He has been an indie favorite for many, many years since his first novel, Montana, 1948. I probably have that wrong, but I know that that's the first one I remember so strongly, followed up by White Crosses. And we are just thrilled that Algonquin Books is publishing your book next month.
Too. Thank you.
Okay. And now Christina Baker Kline, book club favorite, book club darling, I don't know what else to say, mega best-selling author of Orphan Train. I know in our store people always anxiously await your new novels and wonderful historical fiction. Christina lives part-time in Maine, which is where she is right now on the coast of Maine. I'm sure it's quite beautiful and the weather gorgeous. Unfortunately, we're not all there with you staying, but we're thrilled that you're here, and we're thrilled that your book has been moved now to August 25th, published by HarperCollins, The Exiles. So Christina, I know you have a little bit to talk about first.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. This is actually my first appearance because my book was supposed to come out in September, and they've moved it forward almost a month. And so we're sort of we're just launching, which is exciting. So I've actually written up a little thing that's about 4 minutes. And so with your permission, I guess I'll just go ahead.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So in a New Yorker essay titled "Just the Facts, Ma'am," the historian Jill Lepore notes that fiction can do what history doesn't but should. It can tell the story of ordinary people. It's the history of private life, the history of obscure men. She goes on to ask, who are these obscure men? And answers, well, a lot of them are women. So reading this, I better understood my own motivations as a novelist. I'm interested in the stories of people who've historically been on the margins of society, whose experiences have been ignored or overlooked, like the adolescent girls in my novel Orphan Train, for example, who were quote unquote hard to place because of their age and gender. Or the woman in my last novel, A Piece of the World, who, disabled and impoverished, was immortalized in a famous painting by Andrew Wyeth, but never had a voice of her own. Or in my new novel, The Exiles, the poor British and Irish women who committed crimes of poverty and were transported to Australia in the 19th century, and the Aboriginal people whose lives were irrevocably changed when colonists landed on their shores. So the story in The Exiles is told from a variety of perspectives: a naive London governess, a streetwise hustler, a young Scottish midwife, and an Aboriginal girl who was taken from her people as a kind of social experiment, a true story. As in the real life accounts, I studied some of the women's stories in my book, and tragically, but for many convict women from socially stratified Britain and Ireland, Australia eventually became a place of reinvention. Survival and perseverance are an important part of my narrative. It's not widely known that female prisoners were essentially sent by the British government to Australia as breeders, and that today more than 20% of Australians, nearly 5 million people, are in fact descended from transported convicts. These women left Victorian England, one of the most hierarchical societies in history, where the slightest slip of your accent determined which social class you were in, and still does to a certain extent, and moved to a land where none of those rules applied. Once they became freed of their literal shackles, these former convicts could become whatever they wanted to be. They created a whole new world. So this narrative is in marked contrast, of course, to that of the Aboriginal people, whose story of mistreatment and discrimination is similar to our American history, for good reason, as both countries were originally British colonies. Opportunity for some does not necessarily mean opportunity for all. Only recently have many Australians, like many Americans, begun to come to terms with the legacy of colonization. It's my hope that this novel will lead people to learn more about this transformative period in Australia's history. So the epigraph of The Exiles is taken from a poem called The Past by Oodgeroo Noonuccal. She was the first Aboriginal Australian to publish a book of verse in 1964. The poem begins, "Let no one say the past is dead. The past is all about us and within." Noonuccal's words were a guide and a beacon to me as I attempted to shine a light on an era that in many ways felt shrouded in darkness. Writing about people, real and imagined, whose stories are not well known, I wanted to make these long ago lives feel vibrant and relevant. I hope I pulled it off. So thanks.
Thank you, Christina. That's wonderful. And I think you did bring it to life. You made us think. So I thought I'd talk about some of the connections that I felt with both of your books. Clearly, both books have, as Larry said, first it was about the brothers, but it really became Edie's story. And so we have Edie, and then we have Edie, but we don't just have Edie, we have Edie and her daughter Jennifer, and her granddaughter Lauren. And then on Christina's book, we have Evangeline, Olive, Hazel, Mathena. We have these women characters. So these are very much women's stories. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about is kind of not the abuse of the women, but really there's two things I'm trying to get to. One is some of the abuse. I mean, I don't know what other word to use, you know, that they are taken advantage of and belittled in sometimes, and yet they seem, both sets of women seem to rise above that. And then there's also a lot of passion and desire in these books, and the women don't get to really call the shot, if you know what I mean. So can we talk a little bit about that? Maybe Larry, you can go first about Edie. You know, her relationship with her first husband, Dean, is
Sure.
it's
Yeah, it struck me while you were talking that both of these books too are about women and identity, and especially about identities that have been forced upon them, and that they have difficulty because of the time and place where they live, have difficulty asserting their own identities. And it's not as though Edie has a pretty sure sense of who she is, and but the problem is others want to put their identity upon them because it suits their sense of who they are. And now I'm mostly talking about men, but not exclusively.
true. You have Edie's mother-in-law, for example, and yeah, there are other people telling her who she should be and how she should act.
Exactly.
And Christina, for your characters?
Yeah. So the four women in my novel all have sort of different paths that lead them through the story. The first person you meet is Evangeline, who is has led a very sheltered life. She was raised by her vicar father and had no real sense of the world and of how people take advantage of you when you're you know, needy in any way. And her father died and she wasn't provided for and had to sort of figure out a way to make a living, and became a governess, and then sort of fell from one thing to the next. And so her journey into the story, and to suddenly end up from having felt like a respectable person for her entire life, and now to be cast as a criminal, was shocking to her. Whereas the other convict women in my book, most of them have been raised in difficult circumstances, you know, grew up on the streets and had to make their way. And you know, even though, and they ended up in the same cell that Evangeline did, they had very different perspectives going in. They sort of had been in and out of trouble. And so they school her pretty quickly in what that world is like. And then the girl, Mathena, who is based on a real person who lived, she was orphaned. She was the daughter of the chief of the Lorraine tribe, a Tasmanian Aboriginal group, clan. They were exiled to a small island called Flinders Island, where the British government put all the Aboriginal people on, who were on Tasmania. And she was born there, grew up there. And then when the governor and his wife, Lady Franklin and John Franklin, Sir John Franklin, British, the British expats who ran Tasmania, when they came over sort of to see their charges, essentially, Mathina was dancing in the sand and they saw her and decided to take her in to see if they could turn her into a lady. And it was just an experiment for them. They saw her basically as an exotic pet and eventually abandoned her. So her story is interesting to me also because she was educated. She was not, she was the daughter of a chieftain. And then she was educated by a British schoolmaster. And she actually thought of herself as, as someone with this cultural history. And then it was quite a rude shock to be treated with a kind of, to be discriminated against, essentially. So these characters have these very different class and obviously race as well issues to confront. And that was a real exciting challenge of writing the novel.
And Larry, can you speak a lot? I'm glad you brought up the class part because we definitely see that in your book about the people who, I guess they don't seem to have any way out. They don't seem to be able to, and some don't want to be maybe raise themselves up. I don't know what to say. I mean, I don't want to fault somebody because they decide to stay in a small town and maybe not go and break out a whole new world, but I mean if their lives are happy and they're contributing. Of course many of them are not contributing, but you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That's a good point. Edie, for example, I think is perfectly happy in her town of Gladstone, Montana. That's where she is in the first section of the book. That's where she returns in the second, and that's where she is living again in the third section. So she doesn't have any problems with the place so much as she does how she is seen in that place. She has a conversation with somebody at one point about with her granddaughter, for example, about how people saw her when she's in high school. And now she is a grandmother in the same community, and she meets somebody her age who still wants to put on her the same identity that she had in high school. She remembers her because she supposedly did something on graduation night. It doesn't even matter whether she did or not. That then becomes her identity.
Right. And she changes so much over the course of the 40 years. She grows so much and she learns a lot about herself. And I think that is the beauty of her. And I think that in Christina, in the case of Hazel is really kind of, I guess, the one who changes the most. You throw a little surprise in there in the middle, didn't see that one coming. But Hazel kind of becomes the one who changes and makes things happen. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that as a writer, it's very fun to have a character like Hazel who is scrappy and irreverent and sort of street smart, but also young, and determined to survive. She's a midwife in training. Her mother was a midwife. She has the skills to sort of help people in that way, and also then to barter for her own survival. She has this thing that other people need and want, and she also has the passion and the drive to sort of battle the forces that she's constantly facing. My editor and I were talking about the fact that my last novel is about a woman who lives alone on the coast of Maine, and she's disabled. She never really leaves her house. You're almost always in the same room with her. And this novel is such an epic journey. It takes the reader and the characters so far. And there's always something new happening. So it was a completely different writing experience to have this kind of propulsive narrative where, you know, Hazel is intersecting with these other characters, Olive, Evangeline, for a while, and then also Mathina, and they're all experiencing the same new world quite differently.
And you mentioned that there's this long journey, and both of you have journeys. So that's another connection we have. Larry, we spend a lot of time in the cars, and we have a lot of different kinds of cars, but we spend a lot of time in cars. And the people are journeying, and sometimes they're going toward danger, sometimes they're going for rescue, sometimes they're just out driving because they can. And then Christina, you've got this epic journey that takes months and months, and you do spend a good portion of the novel on the ship. And I think part of that maybe is to show us that how darn long it took to get, and how dangerous it was to get from England and all the way around the Cape. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that journey for both of you. And Larry, why so many cars? Why that? Is it? I mean, I know it's the Big Sky State. There's a lot of, you know, people don't mind driving 100 miles. They're like, yeah, get in the car, drive 100 miles.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah, it is the Big Sky country. But I always sort of think of myself as writing about the great indoors. They're in cars, they're in houses, and there's always a ceiling between many of my characters and the big sky. But I do think, no doubt it has something to do with my age, but an awful lot of drama of people's lives plays out in automobiles, and an awful lot of important conversations, I think, occur during those long car trips when you can't walk away from the other person, and you can't, at some point, I think you ask questions that perhaps you wouldn't ask under other circumstances.
And Christina?
Yeah, well, so one of the interesting things about the experience of these women, these British women and Irish women transported to Australia, is that their 4-month-long voyage was not just a transition from one place to another. It was transformative for them, because it was when these women realized that they were no longer English or Scottish or Irish. They were actually on their way to becoming citizens of this new world. And so I wanted to show what it was like to undergo that transformation. You know, as I thought about their predicament, I realized how crucial it was to show the arc of their stories from the beginning, because almost none of them returned, as I said it earlier, to their place of origin. And so what was it like to be sentenced to the land beyond the seas, as Australia was known, given that it was essentially a life sentence? Even if you had stolen, you know, a loaf of bread and you were put on the ship for 7 years, you would probably never be coming back. So it felt like a kind of purgatory, and also a moment where it was a real reckoning for them. And so, yeah, so I spent a lot of time on the ship. Also, I just thought it was really interesting, that whole journey and the way they lived and what they put up with, and how they, as I said, how they had to learn their new identities on the way.
And Larry,
could I charge in
yes,
with a question for Christina?
yes, absolutely.
I would really like to hear about your use of detail. It was just extraordinary. I mean, did you do all of this research in advance of writing? Did you do it while you were writing? The details are wonderful, and they're just organic. They grow so naturally out of the stories and the characters.
That's so nice of you to say. It was such an epic project. I mean, I'm not Australian. I was born and raised in England. I grew up there for 9 years, and I went to graduate school there, and then I taught in London for 2 years. So I I'm very much of the women who were sent over. I'm part Scottish, English, Irish, and Welsh. Those are definitely my people. So I had that visceral knowledge of, you know, sort of that part of the story. But Australia was such a revelation, but also, you know, epic and enormous as a place. And this story is so big. So yeah, I did a ton of research. I went to Australia twice, spent a lot of time in museums that are former penal colonies, et cetera. And then, so I did all this research in advance. And then, yes, as I was writing, I still had to research because you know, you realize the granular details. I don't know, Larry, if you find this as well, because you write about contemporary life, sort of, I mean, you know, past, whatever, 20th century. But even so, you have to research details. I find even writing about the present day, I'm always sort of researching things. But for me, it was the domestic details, the kinds of clothing exactly that people wore, and what kitchens looked like, and all of those kind of questions that aren't part of the big research of the book, but are this much smaller scale research. So like, for example, stumbling on a typical day in a convict maid's life who was working in a home is what gave me the background to write about Hazel working at the governor's house. You know, and so trying to find contemporaneous first-person accounts, I think that information was probably the most useful in some ways, because you're wanting to tell an intimate story. It's a big story, but I mean, meaning the history is a big story, but you want to make it real and human and intimate. And so doing that requires a real attention to the quotidian aspects of people's lives. Yeah, thank you for asking.
And that was a stealing of one of my questions, but that's okay. That was a good question, and I loved it because there had to have been a lot of research in there. We talked earlier briefly about maybe reading a passage from each of your books, very brief, just enough to hook all of you into both reading their books. I see that there are some questions, people have asked about ARCs, and I think the Mountains and Plains is going to work on that. Because I think you definitely want to put these two very, very high on your stack. They're both quick reads, but deep reads, and they'll stay with you for a long time. So I will ask Larry if you would read first, and then Christina.
I'll be happy to. This is a very brief section from, a brief passage from the first section of the novel. And Edie has gone out trying to find her husband and stop him from what she sees as a really foolhardy mission and a dangerous one. And he's doing it to impress her as much as anything else. She hasn't been able to find him, and now she's making her own journey. Edie has been on the bus less than an hour, and its easy bounce and sway are already transporting her towards sleep. Looping the strap around her wrist, she tucks her purse close to her side and away from the aisle, then closes her eyes. But in another moment, she's jarred back to consciousness. A large woman in a man's wool overcoat is lurching up the aisle toward the front of the bus. She's waving her arms and yelling, "Wait, stop, we have to stop." When she reaches the driver, she bends down to tell him something. Edie can't hear what the woman says, but the driver extends an arm in an attempt to calm her and move her back toward her seat. His effort is in vain, however. She continues to hover near him and to plead her case. In another moment, the bus slows and the driver steers the vehicle to the side of the road. The vehicle leans, totters, and finally stops, half on the blacktop and half on the crumbling shoulder. The driver shuts off the engine and pulls on the emergency brake. He stands and turns to face the bus passengers. "Folks, we have a little situation. This lady has forgotten her medication in her luggage, and it's medication she says she needs. So we'll dig out her suitcase, get her pills, and we'll be on our way again. Feel free to step out and stretch your legs." Edie follows everyone else off the bus, but while they gather near the driver as he opens the luggage compartment, she walks behind the bus and stands by herself on the cracked, frost-heaved blacktop. It might not seem like much, this country. A few bare hills, each seeming to rise out of the shadow of the one behind it. Miles of empty prairie, and all of it, hill and plain, the color of paper left out in the sun. You might be out here alone someday with what you thought would be your life, and a gust of wind might blow your heart open like a screen door and slam it just as fast.
Very nice.
Beautiful. Wow.
Beautiful. Christina?
Do I really have to follow that? Okay. Larry, you're amazing. Okay. I'm just reading a minute. And this is the scene where my character, the first character, the first prisoner you meet, who has just committed a crime and is being taken away, and she's in shock. She cannot believe it. Okay. Now sitting in the drafty carriage, she moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials intertwined with the family crest, a lion, serpent, or crown. Cecil is the cad who she had an affair with. It was all she would ever have of him, except apparently for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable beside her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. Evangeline felt a prickle of shock. She had never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd always taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way. The butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. It dawned on her slowly. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Very good.
Yes.
We have some questions. I was looking at some of the questions, and one of the questions was about your research, and at what point, I think it's more about the research into the Aborigine, and where did you find that? What kind of primary sources did you use for that?
So I think it's even in the back of my advanced reading copies, but I have a whole huge thing about that, which is that I was lucky enough to work with really the world expert in Tasmanian Aboriginal history, and even in Australian Aboriginal history, named Dr. Gregory Lehman. He's consulted with many writers, including Richard Flanagan, and who writes novels, and historians. And he runs the Aboriginal Research Center at the University of Tasmania. So through him, I became part of a listserv of contemporary historians and English professors as well, writing about Aboriginal history and culture and politics. And I also just read everything I could get my hands on about this period. There was a conflict called the Black War that decimated the Aboriginal population in Tasmania, and that's pretty much right before my novel begins, and it's the reason that the character of Mathina is exiled to Flinders Island. So I read everything I could about that, and in the presentation I'll be giving, that's a slideshow that takes about 35 minutes. I have a lot of I share my history and my historical research about that. And there are these amazing images and quotes from the authors that I read and worked with.
Good. All right, I didn't see any other questions, Heather. Maybe I'm not looking in the right place, but Larry, I want to go back to our possession. Many of the men in this book And actually, Christina, yours too, both, where it's not so much about, it is about desire in a way, but it's really more about possession. And I think that's the first fissure between the two brothers is this possession of Edie. And then we have it later on in her second story, even more brutal, way more brutal. And then in the third one, the possession shifts to her granddaughter. Can we talk a little bit about that, maybe, and Larry, and why that is? Why, I mean, is that something you've been thinking about for a long time? Why it is that men feel like they have to possess? It has to be.
Yeah, I don't mind speaking for all men all over the planet.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. It is mixed up with desire, and I'm going to go back to that something about identity, which I think also has to do with possession. The woman that these men desire, they need her to be someone. They need her to have a certain identity, and that identity is one that they will impose upon her, rather than simply seeing her for who she is. And in that way, I think identity, desire, and possession intertwine.
Yeah.
I never thought about that until today. That was a great question.
Okay, good. Well, I kept thinking that, and actually I read these back to back, and I kept thinking about the possession idea, and I guess some of the other novels that I've read recently. I have to do another book review tonight, 7 o'clock, if anybody wants to join. Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. But I thought about that too, Christina, with yours, with, you know, the men on the boat, the captain, well, just the possession period. They're shackled, hands and feet, but the just that sheer, I possess you and I own you. And that the sailors, from the lowliest sailor to the captain, you know, I possess you, and I am going to make sure you understand that I possess you.
Right. So, you know, I actually wrote the novel that I wrote takes place in the 1840s to 1868, because the period before that was actually so brutal that I just didn't want to do it. It was, so what happened was British convicts were sent to America for many years. 50,000 indentured servants were sent here, convicts. And then when we won the war, when America won the war, they put an end to that practice. In fact, Benjamin Franklin complained that he suggested that the American colonies should send rattlesnakes to Britain in exchange for the prisoners that Britain sent over here. And Samuel Johnson said, "The Americans are a race of convicts and ought to be grateful for anything we give them short of hanging." Like, it was completely. And then we won the war, and then Australia had to figure out what to do. And so with their refuse, which was mostly men, so they finally settled on Australia. They started dumping their convicts there. And by 1803, Australia was 9-1, men to women. And so the British government devised another plan to round up women for the, you know, flimsiest of reasons, and stuff them on ships, some of which were repurposed slaving ships, and send them off where they would be claimed by sailors, soldiers, ex-convicts, bushrangers, and taken off. And if a man claimed a female convict, her sentence was commuted and she belonged to him. That was the way it went until the late 1820s, when bad reports in the British press made the government change their ways. And they built what they were called female factories, which is workhouses for women. But that was not until 1828. In fact, there's a wonderful but very brutal film called The Nightingale that came out last year, an independent film that I think is available like on Netflix now, that is about that world when women were possessed by men. And so in my period, the women go into female factories, but the vestiges of that kind of possession, it still exist. And women in Australia had a really rough time of it, overcoming, the pervasive sexism that was built into the foundation of their country. So yeah, they were possessed.
Well, and I think that kind of goes back to the struggle also between the long-term struggle that, we have friendships with women, but with men, at least, everyone's a little bit different. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I'm not going to say that. Just don't even ignore that. That was a bad question, Valerie. So I was looking to see if we had any more questions, but I didn't see any in here, Heather. I was looking to see. So Larry, you go back to Bent Rock, White Crosses. You go back to you mine some of your same territory. Is that on purpose, just to go back to maybe places that you've been before in previous books?
Sure. Well, waste not, want not. I mean, once you've created this place, you might as well make uses of it. And
Sure.
I know where everything is in Bent Rock, so it's easy enough to have my characters move around there. But I think part of it is that writers are always looking to claim some territory for their own, and I felt as though that little corner of Northeast Montana hadn't been claimed the way some other parts of the state had been, and so sure, I keep reworking the turf or something like that.
I did read in one review that you've kind of claimed that area, like Faulkner did, and don't make me say the name of that county in Mississippi, but that he kind of claimed that area, and that you have done the same.
It must be terrible to be a novelist in Mississippi. I mean, because Faulkner is always looming over you. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't claim Faulkner's area, I'm sure. It's a little bit different down there, or over there in my case. So, and Christina, you've kind of claimed a lot of different areas. You really you've not stayed in one place. You've kind of made it, I think, which hopefully for your readers, your fans, your 60 bajillion fans that you have across the world, that they're willing to accept that you're going to move to a new place.
Yeah, I mean, for a while I was writing about Maine quite a lot. And even Orphan Train, which people tend to think of as taking place in the Midwest, a lot of it is set in Maine. And so I keep wanting to get back to Maine, and I actually keep wanting to get back to contemporary novels, because what am I doing in this? I don't even know what I'm doing. It's been exciting to do these historical books, but I kind of long for the days when as you said, Larry, I mean, the amount of research is so insane for these books. And even though you research contemporary novels, and I do, but it's a different process. And so unfortunately, I've stumbled on another story that I must tell the next book. So, and it's set in the past again, damn it. But but this time in North Carolina at the time of the Civil War. But it's just I don't know what I'm doing. Next one I'm going to write about Maine in the present day. The one after that.
Well, Larry, yours art is kind of contemporary, but really you do cover a lot of history there. I mean, we have the Vietnam War, we have the 60s. I mean, I felt very true to the outfits that Edie wore and the music that Edie played. And then you flip 40 years, you go 40 years in the future, and the music that Lauren plays, and how foreign it is to Edie, how very different their lives were. And we have the Iraqi War in this 40 years later. We're still at war. We're still sending young men off to be maimed and or killed or come back terribly emotionally wounded. So you did some research into that, right?
Yeah, and with this novel, I made it into the 21st century. I mean, I was sort of stuck in mid 20th century. So yeah, it felt good to sort of get closer to the present. Although one of the terrible things about getting older is that you remember the music of 40 years ago better than you do the music of the time you're
You had
living
to do a
in.
little research into that one, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And maybe it helped that I had a character that I could follow through the years to get me close to the present.
I agree. So I'm looking to see if we have any other.
I have a question for Larry.
Okay.
No, I wanted to ask if there were if sort of what the germ of this book was for you, where if there was anything in real life that kind of led to it, or how it developed.
There was, and the book drifted so far from it. I'll tell you what it was. Years ago, my wife and I were in a bookstore. I was promoting a book, and it was a few novels ago. And it was a book about teenagers and their awful behavior. And there was a restaurant attached. So there was a dinner involved, and the bookstore owner invited people from the community, and we had a nice meal and we're visiting. And then the bookstore owner came over to me and he said, now when the coffee is served, you'll do your presentation. I said, what? A presentation? I didn't know I had to do a presentation. So as a way to buy myself some time and to sort of weasel out of this, I said, okay, let's go around the table now, and everyone here will tell about the most embarrassing or the scariest or the stupidest thing they did as a teenager. Everybody did. They were happy to do it. I mean, some people were boasting about the stupid things they did. But one of the stories somebody told, an older gentleman, he had been an exchange student in Japan. And when he was in Japan, he said he fell in love with a girl over there, but she was a twin and he couldn't tell the twins apart. So he wasn't sure which girl he was in love with. Now, I didn't believe that. I think, you know, if you're in love, you can tell, but still that was the germ. I thought, okay, love affair with twins. And there are a lot of twins in my family, and I've always wanted to do something with twins, but then it just morphed from that to something else. And as I said, Edie took over.
Larry, when you get an idea like that, or you hear something like that, do you write it down? Do you have a sort of notebook or a?
I keep a journal. I might have written it down, but you know, the ideas that are, I think it was Wallace Stegner or somebody who said, if you have to write down how something struck you, it didn't strike you.
Yeah.
But usually those will just stay with me.
Good.
Yeah, definitely. I always describe it as, I get a kind of tingle, like a spidey sense when a story feels like it actually is something I can dig into. I did a few of these events with Eric Larson for his new book, The Splendid and the Vile. Mm-hmm. And he, you know, he writes these enormous nonfiction books, and getting the right subject matter is really half the battle. I mean, because he spends so much time doing it and it takes so much work. And also they're so pretty high stakes given how many copies he sells. So he, you know, he has to, he said, I just have to absolutely feel it in my bones that this is the thing, because once you, it's like an ocean liner, you know, once you set off, it's very hard to turn it around. And I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
I agree. Although I've been wrong too. I mean, you know, there are plenty of them still in the drawer that I thought,
Well, I also have had the opposite, which is that my earlier books, I didn't always, I'm not sure, as I've gone, you know, you get older, you don't know how many more books you have in you. So every one of them really matters to me now. And I'm not going to do something that I'm like, oh, I like this, and I'm going to follow with this and see where it goes. I kind of really need to be all in 100% on it.
I agree, but sometimes you have to write the whole book in order to find out that it doesn't.
That's true. That's true.
Very true.
Maybe not everyone will feel that way, the way you do about it. So, yeah.
Christina, you told us what you're working on, and so we're looking forward to North Carolina during the Civil War. Larry, what are you working on next?
I'm working on a novel.
That's as
There
far
are
as
two
you can
camps.
go.
There are
Okay.
two camps of writers.
I've said too much. I've said too much.
I know. It's so funny. Like, there are writers who just will not talk about it at all, and then there are those
That's
like
true.
me, just happily like
Yeah.
spill all the beans.
Definitely, over the years, I have learned there are people who keep it very close, and then people who are happy to.
I'm afraid if I say anything, it'll sound silly, and then it'll just.
And we'll leave here thinking, who was he? I mean, what was he thinking? What is he doing? Well,
I have the opposite thing, which is that I feel like if I say it, then I have to do it. Like, it can't not happen. If I tell you that this is what I'm going to do, it has to happen. So can I just tell you what my novel is? Because it's actually so exciting. You're going to agree with me that I had to write a historical novel again. Okay, so let's see. I have one sentence. Okay, this is real. I'm 100% Southern. My father's from Georgia. My mother's from North Carolina. My mother's great aunts were sisters named Sarah and Adelaide Yates. They lived at the time of the Civil War, and they happened to marry brothers who were sideshow freaks in a traveling circus named Chang and Eng Bunker. They were the first Siamese twins. And they came to North Carolina and they met these sisters, and one had 10 children and one had 11, and they lived on adjoining hillsides. So those are my mother's great aunts. And how could I not tell that story?
And
so it's from
reunions. They still have family
major family reunions.
I listened to Mobituaries, and that's one of the Mobituaries. Yeah.
I've been in touch with Mo Rocca about this whole thing. He's connected with a few people, and I'm in their Facebook group and whatever.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's called The Foursome, and it's from the perspective of the two women, the two sisters.
Okay, well, we can't wait.
Okay.
And
September 2020, 2022. So 2022.
23 maybe.
Larry and Christina, we were so thrilled that you're here. I know Heather has a little bit of ending notes to talk about to our attendees, and I see from the names that we have been joined by so many different people, including up to interlopers from some other regionals. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm so glad to be able to talk with y'all, and I'm going to turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you both. Thank you all three. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Christina. We were so thankful for your publishers to bring you here today. And thank you, Valerie, as always, for wonderful moderation. I love how you pull insights. I knew you'd be able to pull these two books together, and I thought that was the best thing about this event that had really nothing to do with each other. So I love it, and I love this conversation. Yes, to all of they're not interlopers. Everyone is welcome. Any bookseller is welcome. And so we're delighted to have all of them here today from our region and outside of our region. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that there's a full schedule up on mountainsplains.org, full schedule, all of the upcoming events for summer camp. We'd love to see everyone at them. So thank you again for a wonderful event, and hope to see you tomorrow at our education. How to rock opening your bookstore during the time of COVID. I don't think I have the exact name of it right, but that's the subject matter. So thanks everyone. Thanks Christina.
Thank you,
Valerie.
Thank you.
Christina, can't wait to sell them.
Yay.
So much.
Thank you.
Very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.